The war was ending, until the Allies uncovered a horror beyond victory or defeat. In April 1945, as winter finally loosened its grip on Europe, American soldiers pushed deeper into German-held territory. The front lines were moving fast now. German units were collapsing, retreating in confusion, no longer the iron machine that had once overrun a continent. Everyone knew the end was close. In just a few weeks, on the 8th of May, the Third Reich would sign an unconditional surrender. Officially, the war in Europe would be over. But for the men advancing through that ruined landscape, victory did not feel clean or glorious. Mile after mile, they crossed a country smashed by years of bombing. Cities reduced to skeletons, bridges shattered, trains abandoned on twisted rails. Villages were silent, streets filled with civilians who looked hollowed out by hunger and fear. The soldiers expected destruction. They expected misery. What they did not expect was to stumble into something that went beyond war, beyond battlefields, beyond anything they had been trained to understand. They were about to walk into a reality that would brand itself onto their minds forever and would mark General Dwight D. Eisenhower more deeply than any campaign he had commanded. On 12 April 1945, Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, left his headquarters and personally traveled to a place the American troops had recently uncovered, the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Germany. He could have sent subordinates. He did not. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. What he found there was not a camp in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a place where human beings had been turned into skeletal shadows, where bodies lay unburied, where the air itself seemed contaminated by what had happened. Eisenhower walked through it in person. He saw the corpses stacked like discarded objects. He saw survivors who looked as if they had one foot already in the grave. He would never forget it. A few days later, trying to capture in words what he had witnessed, Eisenhower wrote to one of his generals. The sentences were restrained, military, but beneath them there was shock. "The things I saw beggar description," he wrote. "The visual evidence and the testimony of starvation, cruelty, and sheer brutality were so overwhelming," he admitted, "that they left him feeling physically sick." From that point on, Allied commanders made a decision. The world would see this too. Camp after camp, they brought in photographers, camera crews, and journalists. They did not want anyone later to say, "We didn't know." It was an exaggeration. It was propaganda. The reporters who arrived were often seasoned, hardened by years of covering the war. Many had seen death, front lines, bombings, but what they found in the camps pushed them beyond their limits. Some were stunned into silence. Others tried to describe it and found that words did not stretch far enough. You can hear it in some of their reports, the tremor beneath the sentences. These are not soldiers killed in battle. These are people who have been systematically destroyed. The foul, wretched remnants of human beings, one observer called them. Not numbers on a list, not abstract victims, people like you, like me, reduced to something almost unrecognizable. Images of mountains of shoes, piles of glasses, tons of clothing, and stacks of suitcases with names and addresses still written on them began to circulate. Each heap represented thousands of lives. Each scuffed shoe, each carefully packed valise, spoke of a journey that was supposed to be temporary but had been, in truth, one way. The shockwaves spread across the globe. The film reels, the photographs, the testimonies together, they forced the world to look at what would soon be named one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. And yet a disturbing question hung in the air, one that has never completely faded. Was all of this truly a surprise to the Allied leaders? Could Winston Churchill in London, Franklin Roosevelt in Washington, or Charles de Gaulle in exile really have been completely unaware that, for years, Adolf Hitler's regime was not just imprisoning Jews and political opponents, but coordinating their systematic extermination? Did the Allied governments truly do everything they could to stop it, or at least to slow it? Did they act quickly enough? Did they prioritize it at all? Those questions touch a painful nerve. They challenge not only the story of how the war was won, but the story of how the world responded to evil on a scale it had never seen before. For a long time, They were avoided, softened, or pushed aside. They belonged to one of the great taboos of the Second World War. But the truth is this: the Allies learned what was happening in the camps far earlier than most people imagine. To understand how, we need to step back in time, away from the collapsing Reich of 1945, and into a different moment, one where the war still seemed uncertain, the outcome still in the balance. Warsaw, Poland, midsummer 1940. The city was under Nazi occupation. The Polish state had been crushed, its army defeated, its territory carved up, but the country was not truly silent. Beneath the surface, inside apartments, back rooms, and hidden basements, resistance networks were forming, regrouping, trying to survive. In one of those buildings, a secret meeting was underway. The leaders of the Polish resistance had gathered. The atmosphere was tense. For weeks, the Gestapo had been arresting activists, infiltrating organizations, dismantling networks. Thousands of political opponents had already been captured and shipped off in trains to a camp far to the south, about 300 kilometers from Warsaw. The place had a name that, at the time, meant very little to the outside world: Auschwitz. Within the resistance, there were rumors. It was said that the conditions in that camp were extremely harsh, that prisoners were treated with unusual cruelty, that many did not return. The leaders were deeply worried about their comrades sent there. They wanted information. They wanted contact. They wanted a way to protect their own people. Around the table, among the men discussing what to do, sat one figure who would end up attempting something almost unthinkable: a resistance member named Witold Pilecki. While others hesitated and debated, Pilecki proposed an idea that, on its face, sounded insane. He would deliberately allow himself to be arrested and deported to Auschwitz. Once inside, he would find their imprisoned comrades, organize resistance from within, and eventually prepare a full-scale uprising. It was a plan that could easily have ended in a nameless grave or no grave at all. But for Pilecki, a patriot and soldier, it felt like the only real way to learn the truth and help those trapped inside. He knew which area of the city the Germans were planning to target in their next wave of arrests. Quietly, he positioned himself there and waited. At dawn, days later, troops surrounded the neighborhood. They went door to door. When they reached the building at 40 Woleczna Street, they stormed inside, climbed the stairs, and arrived at apartment number 7. They found exactly what they were looking for: residents they could arrest. Among them was Pilecki, who let himself be taken. 75 years later, his daughter Zofia, by then an old woman, would recall that morning. The sound of boots, the shouting in German, the door slamming open. She remembered him being led away, not knowing if she would ever see him again. On 21 September 1940, after spending 24 hours packed into a cattle wagon with hundreds of others, no real food, no space, no air, Pilecki arrived at Auschwitz. When the doors of the train opened, he stepped not into a regular prison, but into another reality. At the entrance, he saw words that have since become tragically famous: Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. At that time, in autumn 1940, Auschwitz was still relatively small compared to what it would become. There were about 1,800 prisoners, mostly Poles, all under brutal guard, ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers. Nobody left. Nobody knew what really happened inside. From that moment on, Pilecki was no longer Witold the infiltrator. He was prisoner number 4,859. He quickly learned what life in the camp meant. Prisoners were worked to the point of collapse. Auschwitz was a construction site that never stopped expanding, and the workers were the inmates themselves, forced to labor in freezing cold, in thin uniforms, on starvation rations. If you did not die from hunger or exposure, you might die from a beating, or you might simply be chosen as a target during the SS's daily displays of terror. There was a wall in the camp, the so-called execution wall. Every day, prisoners were lined up there and shot. Often they never knew why they had been selected. It was random, arbitrary, designed not only to kill, but to crush any sense of predictability, any feeling that there were rules that might protect you if you followed them. But amid this misery, Pilecki noticed something else. There was a group of prisoners, who were treated even worse than the others, singled out for special humiliation, violence, and hatred: the Jews. In 1940, they were still a minority in Auschwitz, but already the SS treated them as the primary targets, the people against whom any cruelty was acceptable. At first, Pilecki stuck to his original mission: build a clandestine resistance inside the camp. He made contact with other prisoners, created small cells, gathered information, but as he realized the scale and systematic nature of the brutality, his priority began to shift. It was not enough to resist inside. Someone had to tell the outside world what was happening in this place. He started assembling reports. But there was an obvious problem. The camp was built to be inescapable. Double rows of barbed wire, high-voltage fences, watchtowers, armed guards, and, beyond that, a wall. The message could not leave unless a man did. Still, Pilecki was not alone in wanting to try. One day, while walking on a Sunday with a few fellow prisoners, he listened as a young man named Kazimierz Piechowski, only 19 years old, outlined a desperate plan. Together with two companions, Kazimierz wanted to steal SS uniforms, take a car from the camp garage, and literally drive out through the main gate, posing as German officers on official business. The chances of success were tiny. If anything went wrong, they would be executed on the spot. But Pilecki encouraged them. He himself chose to stay. He believed his job was to continue witnessing and organizing inside. But he knew that if they escaped, his words could finally reach someone with the power to act, to be safe. He refused to give them any written document that might betray others if they were caught. Instead, he dictated the message to one of the escapees, who learned it by heart: names, numbers, descriptions, the horror of the camp, compressed into human memory. At noon, during the lunch break, the four men quietly slipped away from their barrack and walked toward the far side of the camp, where the SS buildings were. Acting as if they belonged there, they split into two teams. Kazimierz and two others broke the lock on the uniform warehouse and stole 4 complete SS outfits: boots, belts, caps, everything. The fourth man, a mechanic, infiltrated the SS garage, climbed into the camp commandant's car, a powerful Steyr 220, and got it ready. Minutes later, 3 SS officers and their driver rolled toward the main gate. Guards saw what looked like their own superiors on official business and opened the way. The car drove out into the open road and did not stop. In broad daylight, 4 prisoners escaped from Auschwitz in an SS vehicle, wearing SS uniforms, with the gates held open for them by the very men who believed they were in charge. From that moment, the message Pilecki had entrusted to them began an extraordinary journey. Through the Polish underground, across occupied territory, through Germany, into the unoccupied zone of France, over the border, into Spain, and finally to Britain. In London, the Polish government in exile, in constant contact with Winston Churchill's government, began to receive reports. Not just one, but several. Over time, 8 separate messages from Pilecki reached them, each adding new details. The first one arrived in March 1941. It described daily life in the camp: hunger, beatings, slave labor, arbitrary executions, the deliberate crushing of human dignity. Pilecki wrote about SS guards not as ordinary soldiers, but as executioners. Message after message painted a clearer picture. Auschwitz was not simply a prison. It was part of a growing system that was methodically killing people. And Auschwitz was only one piece of a much larger pattern the Allies were starting to glimpse. In the summer of 1941, another stream of information reached Churchill's desk, this time directly from German military communications. British codebreakers had been intercepting and deciphering radio messages sent from German units on the Eastern Front. In those decrypted reports, SS and police commanders calmly listed how many Jews they had shot in each town, each village, each action. 3,000 here, 4,000 there, without losses on their own side. It was the beginning of what would later be called the Holocaust by bullets, the mass shooting of more than 1 million Jews in fields, ravines, and on the edges of forests, long before gas chambers became the primary method of killing. Churchill read those summaries. He understood, perhaps before almost anyone else in the West, that something uniquely monstrous was taking place. On 24 August 1941, he spoke about it on a BBC radio broadcast. He did not yet have a name for what he was describing, but he knew it was beyond anything Europe had seen for centuries. Since the Mongol invasions of Europe, he said, there had been nothing like this. He called it a crime without a name. His words echoed, but they did not yet trigger decisive action. He was, in many ways, alone. Western Europe was occupied. The Soviet Union, now also under attack by Germany, was fighting for survival. The United States had not yet entered the war, and the scale of the horror was so vast, so unprecedented, that many people inside governments and outside them simply could not yet grasp that it was real. When the Nazi leadership gathered in secrecy in January 1942 inches, a villa at Wannsee, near Berlin, the true machinery of extermination was being finalized. 15 senior officials of the Third Reich convened in elegant rooms overlooking a frozen lake far removed from the front lines, far removed from the suffering they were about to intensify. Their purpose was not military strategy or troop deployments. It was something far colder, the bureaucratic organization of genocide. For 2 hours, they discussed the practicalities of removing Jews from every corner of Europe. They went through lists, country by country, 11 million people in total, marking them for deportation and death. They debated transportation schedules, supply chains, definitions of racial categories, and legal frameworks. Yet, in all this clinical planning, one thing was conspicuously absent. No one used words such as kill, murder, or annihilate. Instead, they referenced the final solution to the Jewish question, a phrase deliberately vague, designed to hide the full horror behind a thin curtain of bureaucratic language. Even in a regime built on terror, discretion was vital. Hitler himself had instructed that the details remain strictly confined to his inner circle. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks, especially when people in the shadows fight to expose them. And in this case, the Allies would soon learn that someone within the German world, someone with access to critical information, was quietly passing warnings to them. For decades, the identity of this anonymous informer remained hidden, but his role was immense. He was not a spy trained by intelligence services, not a resistance hero infiltrating Nazi ranks. He was something more unexpected, a wealthy industrialist named Eduard Schulte. To uncover this mystery, historians had to travel across archives, letters, testimonies, and forgotten documents. In Washington, 2 scholars, Walter LaCour and Richard Brightman, spent years piecing together clues. The pivotal artifact that led them closer to the truth was a single telegram, dated 29 August 1942, sent to the World Jewish Congress in New York. In that telegram, an unknown source reported that Hitler's headquarters had approved a plan to annihilate millions of Jews. It spoke of 3 million to 4 million victims. It revealed that gas would be used and that the process was already underway. The message was chilling. But the sender's name was missing. The only identifying remark was a brief note. The source was a man with close connections to the highest German authorities, whose information was generally reliable. For years, no one knew who he was. The breakthrough came when researchers traced the patterns of information, the timing of meetings, and the access required. All the threads led back to a man born in Silesia, in the German town of Bozen. Eduard Schulte was a figure of influence. He ran one of the largest mining companies in Germany, employing more than 30,000 workers. His factories produced zinc, an essential material for wartime ammunition. This placed him at the intersection of industry, politics, and military need circles that gave him unusual access to Nazi officials. In public, he appeared to support the regime. He attended events, met with Nazi officers, and kept his company valuable to the war economy. But behind the scenes, he despised Hitler. He saw the Nazi leadership as criminals, dragging Germany into moral and physical ruin. He maintained friendships with Jews, traveling secretly to meet them without attracting attention. He also had a Jewish mistress, Doris, who lived in Zurich. Their relationship was hidden with extreme care. Discovery could have meant death for both of them. It was through his corporate connections that Schulte gained access to sensitive material. One of his colleagues, a man named Otto Fitzner, moved through elite Nazi circles and often boasted about the confidential matters discussed in high-level meetings. Thinking he was impressing his employer, he spoke freely, too freely. Schulte, careful not to appear suspicious, encouraged these conversations. And then, one day in July 1942, Pfitzner casually revealed something that froze Schulte's blood. He spoke of a new order from Hitler's headquarters, an order to exterminate millions of Jews across Europe. He mentioned gas being used. He described it as a plan already in motion. Pfitzner didn't grasp the true weight of what he was saying. He was repeating it as if it were just another policy update. But Schulte reacted instantly. In that moment, he knew he had information that could not remain within Germany's borders, and he knew he was facing a decision that could cost him everything: his position, his safety, his family, even his life. Still, he acted. Within days, he arranged a business trip that would take him to Switzerland, neutral territory. Once in Zurich, he followed his usual routine to avoid suspicion. He spent the first evening with Doris, not breathing a word of the truth. To outsiders, he looked like any executive conducting routine wartime business. But the next day, he quietly slipped away for a private meeting with a trusted Jewish banker, a man with connections in London and New York. Before saying anything, Schulte demanded a vow of secrecy. He warned the banker that if his identity ever became known, his life and the lives of those he cared for would be destroyed. Only then did he reveal the truth. The Nazis had launched a plan to murder all European Jews. Gas was already being used. Deportations were underway on a massive scale. Millions were marked for death. The banker listened, stunned, but he kept his promise. And from that meeting came the telegram that reached New York, then Washington, then London. News of unimaginable urgency had been delivered. But what happened next was even more disheartening. On 24 November 1942, Rabbi Stephen Wise, head of the World Jewish Congress, called a press conference in New York. This was the moment Schulte risked everything, for the moment he hoped the world would awaken, that governments would be forced into action. But the world was slow to move. The major newspapers were more interested in military developments. The New York Times placed the news on page 10, hidden between unrelated photographs. The language was cautious, hesitant, understated. 5 short paragraphs summarized one of the greatest crimes unfolding in human history. For many readers, it was too shocking to believe. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others simply could not imagine that such systematic cruelty could be possible. The human mind often recoils from horrors it cannot fully grasp. Still, the information was out, and now Allied governments could no longer say they were unaware. As more reports came in from Polish resistance members like Jan Karski, from underground networks, from survivors who managed to escape, the evidence grew overwhelming. By December 1942, the governments of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free France issued a joint declaration condemning the mass murder of Jews in occupied Europe. They promised that those responsible would face justice. They acknowledged that the number of deaths already reached hundreds of thousands and was rising by the day. But a declaration was all it was. Despite the horror described in their own words, despite the confirmation from multiple sources, the Allies did not change their military priorities. They did not commit new forces to try to disrupt the extermination. They did not bomb transportation routes or facilities. They insisted that the only viable path was to win the war as quickly as possible. Inside Auschwitz, meanwhile, conditions were growing even worse. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the camp expanded dramatically. A second site, Birkenau, was built nearby. 4 vast gas chamber and crematorium complexes began operating with mechanical efficiency. Trains arrived daily, packed with Jews from across Europe. Those considered unfit for work were sent directly to the gas chambers. Pilecki, still imprisoned inside, watched thousands arrive and disappear. He saw transports from France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Greece. He saw entire families cut apart on arrival. He heard the lies told to them, promises of showers and work assignments, while guards handed them soap and towels to prevent panic. He learned how the gas chamber roofs opened, how the poison dropped in, how the crematoriums ran day and night. After nearly 2.5 years inside the camp, Pilecki was reaching his breaking point. He had sent messages. He had built resistance. He had done what few men could have done, but he was haunted by a question. Were his reports truly reaching the Allies? And if they were, why was nothing happening? Finally, he made a choice. If the world would not come to him, he would go to the world. With a group of trusted inmates, he crafted an escape plan. They arranged for him to be assigned to a bakery located outside the main camp, a place where security was lighter. On the night of 26 April 1943, while many SS officers were away on Easter leave, Pilecki and 2 others cut the alarm wires, removed the iron bar guarding the door, and fled into the night. For 947 days, he had lived inside Auschwitz. Now, for the first time, he breathed free air. A photograph taken soon after shows him standing between 2 fellow escapees. He is gaunt, his face sharp from hunger, his clothes loose, but he is smiling a real human smile. He had survived hell, and he carried inside him the truth that the world still needed to hear. Back in Warsaw, he immediately began writing his report, 20 pages, describing in stark detail everything he had witnessed. It included precise descriptions of the gas chambers, the crematorium capacities, the daily executions, the deception, the machinery of death. Without knowing how far the Nazi plan extended, he nevertheless captured its essence. His report traveled through resistance channels and reached London, joining the accumulating evidence piling on Allied desks. But while the Allies now had overwhelming proof, their response remained constrained. Some Jewish organizations proposed bombing the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, hoping to halt the flow of deportation trains. Military advisors rejected the plan almost immediately. Rail lines, they argued, could be repaired within hours. Risking aircraft and pilots for a target that would quickly recover made no strategic sense. But another proposal soon emerged, one that reached the desk of Winston Churchill himself. Bombing the gas chambers and crematoriums directly. Churchill reacted instinctively in favor. He urged his war secretary to take any measures possible. He suggested that the RAF should do whatever they could. But Churchill's voice, strong as it was, could not override the practical concerns of military planners. Precision bombing was almost non-existent at the time. Bombs often fell miles from their targets. The crematoriums were surrounded by overcrowded barracks. A poorly aimed mission could kill tens of thousands of prisoners and miss the gas chambers entirely. And behind all these arguments lay the deeper, unspoken truth. The Allies had already decided their priorities long before. Their strategy was to defeat Germany first, at all costs, and only then fully confront the horrors of the camps. Yet in the spring and summer of 1944, Allied aircraft were flying over southern Poland. They bombed industrial plants just 5 kilometers from Auschwitz. It was physically and technologically possible to hit the camp. They simply chose not to. Historians still debate whether such an attack would have saved many lives. Some believe that tens of thousands could have been spared. Others argue that the Nazis would have found other methods or rebuilt quickly. But what is beyond debate is this. While the Allies debated and delayed, the killing accelerated. Between May and July 1944, just 3 months more than 420,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed. By the time the Red Army liberated the first camps, millions had already been murdered, and the world could no longer pretend that it did not know. When the Soviet army pushed into Poland in early 1945, they became the first to reach the Nazi killing centers. What they discovered defied human comprehension. They walked into silent barracks lined with bunks filled by bodies, storehouses packed with belongings stolen from the dead, and crematoriums still warm from recent fires. The scale was so vast, the machinery so organized, that even hardened soldiers struggled to process what they were witnessing. The Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence, blowing up gas chambers, burning documents, forcing prisoners to march westward, but the truth was too enormous to erase. Millions had been murdered. 6 million Jews among them. The world would eventually understand the numbers, but in those first days it was not statistics that struck the soldiers. It was small details: a child's shoe, a doll missing an arm, a suitcase with a home address, clothing folded as if its owner might return for it. These fragments whispered stories the dead could no longer tell. And while journalists and filmmakers documented everything for the world to see, there remained a troubling shadow behind the tragedy, a painful realization that the knowledge of mass murder had reached the Allies long before liberation. They had known, at least in part. They had spoken in statements and declarations. But when it came to action, the camps were never prioritized. Behind this failure were countless individuals who had risked everything to warn the world. Men like Witold Pilecki and Eduard Schulte, whose bravery had gone largely unrecognized during the war, and whose lives were irreversibly scarred by what they had dared to reveal. For Pilecki, escaping Auschwitz was not the end of his fight. Once he delivered his report and rejoined the resistance in Warsaw, he continued to work against the Nazi occupation. He believed that once the Allies had undeniable proof, intervention would follow. But as months passed and no rescue came, a hollow dread settled in. Although the world now knew the truth, the machinery of mass murder continued uninterrupted. Still, Pilecki pressed on. The Warsaw resistance needed every capable fighter, and he threw himself back into the struggle. When the Warsaw Uprising broke out in August 1944, he fought in the street battles against the SS and Wehrmacht. By then, Poland's situation was desperate. The city fought alone, hoping for Soviet support that never arrived. After 2 months of brutal combat, the uprising was crushed. Pilecki was captured again, this time by the Germans, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war, not a political inmate. Compared to Auschwitz, captivity in a POW camp was bearable, and he survived until the war's end. But survival did not guarantee freedom. Once Germany surrendered, Poland fell under a new domination, this time from the Soviet Union. A communist government backed by Moscow took control. For men like Pilecki, who had served both the Polish army and the anti-Nazi underground, this new regime viewed them not as heroes, but as threats. They were too independent, too patriotic, too connected to the West. Pilecki, unwilling to leave his homeland in the hands of yet another occupying force, joined efforts to document Soviet-controlled abuses and send reports to the Polish government in exile in London. He believed the world needed to know the truth about what was happening after the war, just as he had tried to reveal the truth during the war. But this time, there was no escape plan, no hidden network capable of rescuing him. In May 1947, the Communist secret police arrested him. They accused him of espionage, sabotage, and treason. His trial was a show trial evidence, fabricated, witnesses intimidated, the verdict predetermined. Pilecki told friends that Auschwitz had been easier than the interrogations he endured under the communist regime. After months of torture, he stood before the court, defiant and unbroken. He refused to confess to false charges. On 25 May 1948, he was executed by a single shot to the back of the head. For decades, the communist government erased his name from Polish history books. His grave was unmarked. His family was silenced. Only after the fall of communism did Poland begin to honor him as a national hero, a man who knowingly walked into the gates of Auschwitz to reveal the truth to the world, and who paid the highest possible price for serving that truth until the end. Schulte's fate, while less brutal, was also marked by exile and sacrifice. After passing information on the final solution to the Allies, he lived in constant danger. The Nazis eventually discovered his role, though details remain unclear. Perhaps it was loose talk, perhaps intercepted messages, perhaps an accidental clue in the wrong hands. But by 1943, the Gestapo was hunting him. He fled Germany and took refuge in Switzerland, living quietly under the radar. He married his long-standing mistress, Doris, finally able to acknowledge publicly the relationship that could have gotten them both killed during the war. After the conflict ended, he lived out his remaining years in Zurich, far from the country whose crimes he had tried to expose. His courage had been real, but because his identity needed to be protected, his role remained obscure for decades. He died in 1966 without seeing his efforts fully recognized. The stories of Schulte and Pilecki reveal a deeper truth. While governments hesitated, individuals acted with astonishing bravery. These were people who refused to be silent while the world stood at the edge of darkness. Their reports carried the earliest, clearest warnings about the Nazi extermination program. But even their sacrifices were often overshadowed by political priorities, military calculations, and the cold pragmatism of wartime decision-making. The Allies, for their own reasons, chose not to make the camps a central target. They insisted that the swiftest way to save lives was to win the war itself. And yet, in the spring and summer of 1944, Allied planes flew directly over Auschwitz. They bombed factories supplying the German war effort, plants located mere kilometers away from the gas chambers. The crematoriums and chambers remained untouched. The question has echoed through history. If the Allies could bomb nearby targets, why not the killing machinery itself? Why not disrupt the process, even temporarily? Historians still debate what might have happened. Some argue that even a partial strike could have slowed the extermination, buying time for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. Others insist that precision bombing was too unreliable, that the Nazis would have rapidly rebuilt the facilities or simply found alternative methods. The truth lies somewhere in between, but the fact remains. For 3 months in 1944, at the height of the killing in Auschwitz, the Germans murdered 420,000 Hungarian Jews. Trains arrived relentlessly, day after day. Entire communities vanished in weeks, and the Allies, constrained by strategy, politics, and limited military priorities, did not intervene. When the war finally ended and the camps were liberated, the revelation that millions had been murdered shook the global conscience. Leaders who had hesitated during the conflict now spoke passionately about justice. The Nuremberg trials exposed the machinery of genocide in harrowing detail. Witnesses described the gas chambers, the shootings, the forced labor, the starvation, the medical experiments. Photographs and film footage captured what words struggled to convey. But while the major perpetrators were prosecuted, the deeper question lingered. Why had so many warnings gone unanswered? How could the most powerful nations in the world know about a crime of such magnitude and fail to act decisively? In the years that followed, this question became one of the greatest moral wounds of the 20th century. It forced historians, politicians, and ordinary citizens to confront the limits of political will, the failures of imagination, and the dangers of indifference. Yet, even within this darkness, the courage of individuals shines all the more brightly. Pilecki, the man who walked into a death camp to illuminate the truth. Schulte, the industrialist who risked his life to warn the world about the final solution. Countless resistance members, couriers, spies, and informants, people whose names remain largely unknown, who smuggled information through the most dangerous networks in Europe, who refused to look away even when governments did. Their actions remind us that heroism often comes not from armies or governments, but from solitary decisions made by ordinary human beings who refuse to remain silent. They remind us that even when nations fail, individuals can still choose courage. By 1945, the world had seen the full extent of the Nazi atrocities. Liberation brought relief, but also horror. Soldiers who opened the gates of the camps described the scenes as nightmares made real. Survivors were so fragile they seemed almost transparent, their faces marked by a suffering no words could capture. Many could not even celebrate their freedom. Too many family members were gone. Too much pain had been inflicted. The Allies recorded everything. They wanted the evidence preserved. They wanted future generations to see and understand what had happened. But the revelation also forced them to look inward. It challenged the comfortable narrative of the war as a straightforward struggle between good and evil. It revealed that even righteous nations could hesitate, miscalculate, or prioritize strategy over humanitarian crisis. It asked difficult questions. Why did early warnings receive so little attention? How could governments acknowledge the truth without acting directly to stop it? What would have happened if someone had intervened sooner? And perhaps the hardest question of all, do nations learn from such failures, or do they repeat them in different forms? The war ended, but these questions never did. For the families of victims, for the handful of survivors, for the men who tried desperately to raise the alarm, the burden of memory remained. They understood that forgetting was the final victory the Nazis sought. They insisted the world must remember not only the 6 million murdered Jews, but the countless moral failures that allowed the crime to reach such magnitude. The story of the Holocaust is therefore not only a record of Nazi brutality, it is also a record of the warnings that were sent, the decisions that were delayed, and the courage of those who tried to shatter the world's disbelief. By the time Europe began to rebuild after the war, the world had already entered a new era, one overshadowed by the emerging tensions between East and West. The ashes of the Third Reich had barely cooled before Europe was divided once again, this time between democracy and communism. Amid this geopolitical transformation, the stories of the men who had risked everything to reveal the truth about Auschwitz and the final solution were pushed aside, buried under political fears, Cold War silence, or simply the inability of societies to face the scale of the horrors that had taken place. Yet their sacrifices remained, etched into history like scars. Witold Pilecki, the man who had volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz, who had escaped to tell the world, who had fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and who had refused to abandon his belief in a free Poland, was dead, executed by his own country's post-war rulers. For decades, his name could not be spoken publicly in Poland. The communist regime considered him an enemy, a spy, a symbol of defiance they could not tolerate. His family lived in the shadow of fear, forbidden to speak of him, forced to pretend that one of the greatest heroes of the Second World War had never existed. His body was never returned. To this day, the location of his grave remains unknown. In a tragic twist of irony, a man who survived the Nazi death machine was silenced by the very regime that claimed to liberate Europe from fascism. His story illustrates how the aftermath of World War II was not defined solely by justice or moral reckoning, but also by political convenience and ideological control. The truth he fought so hard to deliver during the war did not protect him afterward. Eduard Schulte, the industrialist who had first revealed Hitler's plan for the extermination of Europe's Jews, lived out his remaining years in exile. After fleeing Germany to escape Nazi retribution, he settled quietly in Switzerland. He married Doris, the woman whose Jewish identity had forced their relationship into secrecy during the war. But even in safety, he lived with the emotional burden of knowing he had done what he could, yet the response had been far less than what was needed. His warnings had been real. His information had been precise. He had risked everything. But did it change the course of the catastrophe? History suggests it did not. Not because his actions lacked courage, but because the world lacked urgency. The Allies, for their part, had entered the war to defeat Hitler militarily, not to stop genocide. That was not their stated goal, not their strategic priority, and not how they planned their operations. Even when overwhelming evidence reached them from resistance movements, intercepted German messages, escaped prisoners, and informants inside the Nazi machine, their calculations remained primarily military. Save Europe by defeating Germany, they argued. Save lives by ending the war. The camps, they insisted, were secondary. In retrospect, that reasoning feels painfully insufficient. It raises haunting questions that historians continue to debate. Could more have been done? Could bombing the railways or crematoria have slowed the killing? Would such attacks have stopped or disrupted the process of mass murder? Or would they have risked killing even more prisoners? The answers are complex, but the moral weight behind the questions remains heavy. Meanwhile, the horror continued. Between May and July 1944, the Nazi killing system operated at its most lethal pace. In just 12 weeks, more than 420,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. The majority were dead within hours of arrival. The killing was so rapid, so industrialized, that even some SS personnel later claimed they could not psychologically process the volume of death they were inflicting. When the war finally ended and the last camps were liberated, the Allied leaders were confronted with a truth they could no longer avoid. The genocide had succeeded in murdering millions. Photographs, film footage, survivor testimonies. Everything they documented became an indictment not only of Nazi cruelty, but of global inaction. And yet, In the aftermath, blame was rarely placed on the Allied powers. The focus shifted instead to the perpetrators, the SS officers, the camp commanders, the political architects of the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials brought many of them to justice. The testimonies given in courtrooms became some of the most powerful evidence of the barbarity of the Nazi regime. Survivors spoke of gas chambers, brutal medical experiments, starvation, forced labor, and torture. The world listened in horror. But the deeper, uncomfortable question, what could have been done earlier, remained largely unasked. It would take decades before historians and governments began openly discussing the possibility that early intervention might have saved lives. The subject was painful, contentious, and morally complicated. Governments rarely wished to revisit decisions made during wartime, especially decisions that revealed blind spots or failures. Even within Jewish communities, the topic stirred controversy. Some believed that no military action could have stopped the scale of the genocide. Others argued that silence or hesitation from the most powerful nations on earth accelerated the destruction. But beneath these debates, something else began to slowly take shape: recognition. Recognition that warnings had been delivered. Recognition that individuals had taken extraordinary risks. Recognition that governments had known far more, far earlier, than they had admitted publicly during the war. Recognition that the Holocaust was not only a story of perpetrators and victims, but also a story of those who tried to intervene and those who did not. And recognition that the world had failed to respond in time. In the decades after the war, as more archives opened, more survivors spoke, and more documents surfaced, the stories of Pilecki, Schulte, and countless unnamed informants finally began to emerge. Their courage highlighted a truth the world had long ignored. The genocide was not carried out in perfect secrecy. The shadows had holes. Information seeped through. Messages traveled. People resisted with extraordinary bravery. Some of those warnings reached the highest levels of power. But political priorities, misjudgment, disbelief, and the overwhelming scale of the conflict meant that action came too late. Meanwhile, the lives of the informants themselves were shaped, sometimes destroyed, by what they had done. Pilecki's family lived under surveillance. Letters he wrote from prison were censored. His children grew up not knowing the full truth of their father's heroism. Only after the fall of communism did Poland begin to honor him. Monuments were erected. Books were written. His report from Auschwitz, the one he risked everything to deliver, was finally published openly. His legacy transformed from hidden dissident to national hero. Schulte's story also resurfaced. Historians traced his role, uncovered the telegrams, and connected the dots that had long been scattered. His grandson recalled him as a tall, confident man, respected by many, but also deeply burdened by the knowledge he carried. He had tried to alert the world early, when millions were still alive, hoping that such a monstrous plan would spark an immediate global response. Instead, his revelation had been buried in newspapers, overshadowed by military updates, brushed aside by skepticism,